I'm Andy Agapangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. We are a UK-based certified social enterprise. We have a huge interest in the workings of the financial services industry, an industry that we believe to be profoundly important to the well-being of society, to economic stability, and through that for political stability too. Much of our work since I set up the TTF in May 2015 has revolved around the issue of people experiencing harms as a direct consequence of regulatory failure. And in so many ways, that is what tonight's event is all about. We're going to be taking a very close look at a current Financial Conduct Authority consultation exercise about the consumer duty. During tonight's meeting, you're going to be hearing some things that may not sound like they can possibly be true, that may sound like surely that must be made up, that may sound too strange to be believable. I would invite you, of course, to think whatever you want to think, but if you can, just suspend disbelief and be open-minded to what you're going to be hearing. I say that because it's one thing when an organisation gets things wrong. There's no reason at all to expect that every organisation will always get everything right. Therefore, it follows that any organisation, be they a regulator or otherwise, will from time to time get things wrong, just as we as individuals do. But what you might find particularly interesting about what we're going to be covering tonight is whether the Financial Conduct Authority does or can from time to time find itself doing things that are a little bit less innocent than an innocent mistake. So as I say, please do remain open-minded to that possibility. The running of order of our speakers this evening is as follows. We're going to be hearing from Mark Bishop, who many of you know very, very well indeed. We'll then be hearing from Ian Duffield. Whilst Mark is going to be delivering an essentially technical presentation about the facts of the situation, Ian's going to be talking about his case and his wife's case. Ian and his wife were caught up, unfortunately, very unfortunately, by the Woodford scandal. Hundreds of thousands of people have been impacted by the Woodford scandal. And I think I'm right in saying that to date, nobody has really been held to properly account for it. Ian's case is going to be very interesting. And I think what you might find particularly interesting, if you don't already know, is what the Financial Conduct Authority did to manoeuvre itself out of a difficult position. I think that's a fair way of putting it. We'll then be hearing from Richard Emery. Rich is going to be focusing on an area in which he has remarkable expertise, in the sense that he's often invited onto the TV and onto the radio and to the press to talk about authorised push payment fraud. Rich is going to be sharing with you his balanced, sensible, fact-based, evidence-based account of what's going wrong in that space and what needs to change for things to be put right. Hopefully, we're also going to be joined by Sam Rushworth MP this evening. Sam's with us tonight. Most of you won't know Sam at all because Sam's a very new Labour MP. In a moment, I'm going to invite you all to applaud Sam because Sam has volunteered to become a member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. But more importantly, I would say, he's also volunteered to help to lead it. And that means that Sam's with us tonight. It's a Transparency Task Force event, as you know. It's not an APPG event. But Sam's with us tonight, giving himself a chance, I guess, to understand some of the issues that many folks are becoming increasingly concerned about when it comes to the regulation of financial services in the UK. Could I please invite everybody now to applaud and show appreciation for all of our speakers and also to Sam Rushworth for becoming a co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on investment fraud and fair financial services. You're very warmly welcome in this crowd, Sam. It was lovely to meet you last week. It really was. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be hearing from Sam later on. Feel free to chip in at any stage, Sam, as others will. We have quite a kind of conversational way of doing things. For those of you that weren't here at the very, very beginning, I found myself the quietest place I can in Dublin, but you will from time to time hear a door slam. There's a big wooden door just 20 feet away from me. So forgive me if it's noise that distracts you. I'll do my best to stay on mute most of the time. But first, let's hear from Mark Bishop. And please, please be open-minded to what Mark is about to say. Mark is, without doubt, one of the most evidence-based people I know. And I find what Mark says to be very compelling because he's always able to quite literally show you the evidence to back up what he's saying, which is fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for being the backbone of this evening's event. Over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Thank you. I'm going to share screen. So I'm first going to say, can you see my screen? Thank you, Andy. Thank you. So what I'm now going to do is to give you a slideshow. And you can see here the title, which kind of says where I'm coming from here. The FCA's consumer duty. And I ask the rhetorical question, is it an audacious bait and switch? Well, as Andy said, I do try to be evidence-based in what I do. I have no time for conspiracy theorists and people who come up with wild generalizations that are not backed by fact. So I am going to be backed by fact and be very evidence-based in my presentation today. So I'm going to give you the chronology. The first thing that happened was that Parliament passed an Act of Parliament called the Financial Services Act 2021, and it obliged the FCA to create a duty of care. So for background, this is particularly, I think, interesting for Sam because it gives you the parliamentary history. This was a time when COVID had been restricting how Parliament was operating. So it was not normal business as usual for Parliament, and they had needed to pass this Act of Parliament in order to onshore temporarily all of the EU's regulations that relate to financial services. And for years, really since the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 came into effect, ever since then, a lot of campaigners and MPs and peers had been wanting to create a duty of care to be owed by financial services firms to consumers. And some peers saw this as a wonderful opportunity, this bill, to introduce an amendment which would create a duty of care. And there is a strict legal term. It's a legal term, duty of care. It has a specific and well understood meaning. There are many precedents about what a duty of care is. It's an obligation on one party to avoid causing reasonably foreseeable harm to another party. And of course, you can name who those parties are. In this case, authorised persons, which is the firms and individuals regulated by the FCA, and also consumers, which has a legal definition which is well known in financial services. So this new Act of Parliament has Section 29, which created an obligation on the FCA to carry out a public consultation about whether it should make general rules providing that authorised persons owe a duty of care to consumers. It was inserted during ping pong, which is where Act of Parliament or bill is at this stage is going between backwards and forwards between the Commons and the Lords. It had been overrunning. There was pressure on parliamentary time, and the government at the time said, yeah, just let it through. And of course, a lot of us campaigners were suspicious at the time. Why haven't they put up a fight? This is a thing they've been trying to stop for 20 years. And of course, then we found out why in step 2. The FCA basically put forward a consultation document about what they call the consumer duty. And it said, this thing called the consumer duty is really just our name for a duty of care. It's the same thing. Now, what then happened was that the Bar Council, which is the professional body of the barristers in the UK, took the really unusual step, I think maybe even unprecedented step, of replying to this consultation, which was not about the law, not about the rights or the obligations of barristers. It was about financial services. And they said, basically they said that in general accepted legal terms, the thing that is being put forward as consumer duty is not a duty of care. So that was them. we at Transparency Task Force also had concerns about it, and we worked with Ian Mitchell Casey, a King's Counsel who volunteers, does very valuable work with us, with whistleblowers, and generally in financial services, consumer rights. And he basically said, we believe the FCA may be placing itself in breach of the law as a result of this consultation exercise, and that certain statements contained within the paper may have the effect of misleading respondents in a way that could jeopardize the integrity of their responses to such an extent they should be not be relied upon in setting policy. And then he goes and explains how this consultation exercise exists because of an obligation to consult on whether there should be a duty of care. We concern the consultation exercise being conducted by the FCA fails to address that issue, consequently it's in breach of its statutory obligation. So it was very clear to the FCA that basically what it was doing was a switch and bait. You were asked by, well, you're not asked, you were told by Parliament to consult on a duty of care. You're actually consulting on a thing called a consumer duty. Well, of course, consumers were saying, well, we'd quite like a duty of care, please. And the industry was saying, well, thank you, we like this consumer duty. And so the consumer duty went ahead. So at the time, the FCA, Transparency Task Force, had been lobbying any project could get its hands on, particularly the Treasury. And had written to the Treasury saying, you are the sponsors of this bill, now an Act of Parliament. You must surely be responsible for enforcing it. So if the FCA has breached it by not consulting on a duty of care, then surely it's for you to do something about it. And we've been ignored and rebuffed. But long after it was too late, I think round about the time that we have an engagement with Andrew Griffith, MP, as he now is, who then was minister, who I think was probably less bad than his predecessor and his successor. He basically could see that there was a bit of a problem. And so he sent us a letter in which he acknowledged that the consumer duty was not a duty of care. But his defense or his justification was, well, the FCA, through its consultation, decided that a duty of care was not required. People didn't want it. But of course, that's not really the case, because a load of consumer representatives said, actually, no, we really would like a duty of care. And of course, a lot of people responded to the consumer duty saying, yeah, we quite like the consumer duty, but they hadn't been told that it wasn't a duty of care. In fact, they had been lied to. They'd been told that it was a duty of care when it wasn't. So all of that happened, and the consumer duty came into effect. It came into effect for new products in July of 2023, and for existing closed book products, so products that are no longer being marketed, in July of this year. So it's definitely a fait accompli. And what then happened was this summer, the FCA proposed to delete rules from its handbook that overlap with the consumer duty. Now, if you look at it very superficially, that is not an illogical thing. If you've got a duty on firms to behave in a certain way, and you've got a handbook that says you've got to behave in a certain way, why do you need to have things in both places? Well, I'll tell you why you do need to have that. And it's because there is a difference between the consumer duty and a genuine duty of care, in that if there is a breach of the consumer duty, consumers do not have a right to sue. Now, this difference is also present when you compare the consumer duty against the handbook. If a firm or an authorised person, an individual, breaches a rule that's in the FCA handbook, a consumer can sue. Also, the FCA can go down a restitution route under sections 382 to 384 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, or it can go down the redress route, which is basically a group scheme for all of the firms in the sector, under section 404 of the same act, which would not be the case. So what we've got here is an idea that superficially there would be a tidying up of duplication. That seems like a good thing. But in reality, there would be a removal of rights that existed for 22 years from consumers by taking things out of the rules section of the handbook and keeping them instead in the consumer duty. So when we as consumer activists saw section 29 of the Financial Services Act 2021, we thought, fantastic, at last we're going to get a private right of action. We're going to get some extra rights. Then what we got was the consumer duty, and we thought, well, it's not of a great deal of value, but at least we haven't lost anything. And now what's going to happen is we're likely to lose something, the right to sue for breaches of the rules. of a lot of the rules. Now, in its consultation exercise issued, I think, as early August, the FCA acknowledged this. It said, and this is the quote here in my presentation, we are aware that issues around a private right of action may get raised when considering potential changes to our handbook. FSMA provides that a private person who has suffered a loss through a firm's breach of one of our rules has a right to take legal action for damages from the firm. Several routes to redress, including compensation from the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, Section 402, 404 FSMA schemes, depend on there being a private right of action. We can switch off the private right of action when making or changing a rule, and no private right of action is currently attached to any of the requirements under the duty. We may need to consider the impact this has if, in the future, we relied on the duty to remove rules to which a PROA applies. However, we are not seeking input on this issue at this stage, as it would need to be considered in the context of specific proposals. So what they're saying there is, when you respond to this consultation, we don't want you to talk about the fact that taking something out of the rules and keeping it in the consumer duty takes away a private right of action. I'm not interested in that at all. Later down the line, we may possibly consult about it. But I have to say, if you believe that's going to happen, I've got a bridge to sell you. What's happening here is, a move towards lighter touch regulation by taking away a right. Now, there is possibly a small glimmer of hope here, in that this was a consultation issued, under, or maybe planned under a previous government. We have a new government. That government may take a different view. But I think it's probably important to talk first about what this means for consumers. And it's this: the duty of care that parliamentarians wanted financial services firms to owe you has not been introduced. Here we are, 3 years after that Act of Parliament. You have no private right of action. So you have no, of course, it's called
duty of care.
Duty of care. There's no duty of care to be owed to you by authorised persons. And some people will say, well, yeah, but if you have a duty of care, this means that financial services firms will have an additional burden of costs. They will be risk averse in launching new products. There will be less competition. Where is the competition and growth that both the outgoing government and the new one would like to see from financial services? Well, actually, I think this is a very weak argument, because we are, by most measures, the second biggest financial services sector in the world, but the biggest by a huge margin is the United States. Huge swathes of the United States industry don't just owe a duty of care to consumers, they actually are subject to a fiduciary duty. Now, in the kind of league table of kind of relationships between consumers and firms, the very top thing is a fiduciary duty. It is basically that you've got to provide the best products and services. You've got to put the interest of the consumer first ahead of your own. That's amazing. In the middle, you have this thing, a duty of care. You've got to avoid causing reasonably foreseeable harm. So, you can slightly overprice your product. You can offer the next best product because it's, suits you better or it's easier for you. All of that will be acceptable. But what you mustn't do is, cause a reasonably foreseeable harm. And then below that, you've got contractual rights only. So if a contract exists between the consumer and the firm, well, actually, whatever the contract says must happen. That is a much lower situation. And that's what we've got in the UK. So we are 2 steps below where the United States is. And the idea of having a duty of care is simply to move us 1 step up towards the standard that existed in the US since God was a boy. Now, when you look at the American industry, it is not struggling. There is not a lack of competition. People make big margins. It is quite possible for the financial services firms to grow and prosper under a consumer duty, under a duty of care. So what we have in the duty of care in the consumer duty is not nothing. It is something. The consumer duty is something. It does have obligations placed on firms. Those obligations may be more rhetoric than reality, in the sense that if there is a breach, consumers cannot sue. They are reliant on the FCA to enforce. And the FCA relatively rarely does this, and very rarely goes down the route of restitution or redress. I can give you examples of how there are exclusions as well. One of them, which I know Ian Duffer will talk about later, is the Woodford case, where several £billion was lost by consumers, a lot of it pension savings. when they invested in the Woodford Equity Income Fund. Now, one of the limits to that is that complaints against the fund manager, which is Woodford Investment Management Limited, the FSCS, sorry, the Financial Ombudsman Service, are undermined by the fact that in the detail of the FCA's rules, there is not a right, there is not a specific rule against malinvestment by fund managers. So there's nothing there for people. If there had been a private right, so if there had been a duty of care, almost certainly consumers would have been able to sue, because they would say investing money that was subscribed to an equity income fund, but was actually used to invest in startup businesses that are not listed, that would be illegal to sell to consumers, investment in directly, and that are run by friends of yours, and some of whom may have given you goods and services without charge as well. Doing all of that is causing reasonably foreseeable harm. Therefore, it would definitely be within the remit of the Ombudsman and also of the courts. Another example would be the Phillips Trust Corporation case, where a lot of elderly people were advised by their building societies to take out family trusts to avoid care home fees and inheritance tax. Those trusts didn't have any of those benefits, and the people who set up the trusts subsequently set up a second company that took over the trusts, and it invested that money in unregulated collective investment schemes that were probably just money laundering exercises to steal the money. What happened there was the FCA said, this is an unregulated activity, therefore our principles of business do not apply. Under the consumer duty, there is a specific exclusion that says if you have in the supply chain or distribution chain of products unregulated firms, then the regulated firm is not responsible, or the authorised firm is not responsible for the activity of the unauthorised firm. So at that point, there would have been a perfect get out. Whereas if there had been a genuine duty of care, then it would have been a very strong argument to say, well, it was reasonably foreseeable that if you introduce these customers, elderly and vulnerable, to these firms that are making trusts who are not authorised by the FCA, not authorised by the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and whose claims are clearly untrue, it is likely that they are going to be harmed. Therefore, actually, you're in breach of your duty of care to them. So now you not only have not got this consumer duty, so not only have you not got the duty of care you thought you were going to get, but you've also got now the prospect of rights that you did have under the FCA's handbook being taken away from you. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the implications for the industry. Well, the first thing to say is that the consumer duty has created a huge burden of compliance costs on the honest majority of firms. Even things like the salaries of compliance managers going up, notably during this period. And also, the other thing is a continuing erosion of consumer confidence in the sector, given the removal of rights and the continuing number of scandals that there have been in recent years and that will, I'm sure, still keep flowing. For bad actors, of course, it's been really good news. The consumer duty has loads of exclusions in it, and you can easily design a bad product or a scam around them. The risks of consequences will be lower than ever before because of the removal of rules from the handbook. And there's also this fantastic feeling that the FCA's got your back, that it's designing regulation for the benefit of the bad actors, not the good actors, certainly not consumers. And finally, what about politicians? Well, I know we've got a politician on this call today, Sam Rushworth, and I know, Sam, you came into Parliament in this general election, July 2024. So thankfully, the feeling of being kind of, if you like, put in your place or kind of shamed or, humiliated by the FCA wouldn't apply to you. But I think people who were involved in the Financial Services Act 2021, who thought they'd done a good thing for consumers in creating the obligation on the FCA to consult and bring forward rules about a duty of care, I think that they should feel quite embarrassed, actually quite humiliated. They've been undermined by this regulator who believes it can ignore the law with impunity. I also think if I were a politician, I'd have an uncomfortable suspicion that the Treasury, who is unwilling to enforce against the FCA for what it did, and the FCA have protected or are protecting the city's bad actors. which damages the reputation of the sector, causing it to be in relative decline, driven by misconduct scandals and also the suspicions of foreign governments and regulators that actually the city is kind of is subject to lax and captured regulation, and therefore we should not be giving it, very tariff-free and obstacle-free access to our markets. So actually, it's a kind of slow decline that lobbyists will say is about competition and growth, but is actually about the opposite of that. It's protecting a few bad actors. So, rhetorical question: what can we do about it? Well, thinking first of Transparency Task Force, we should of course respond to a consultation as it's drafted and ask a lot of technical questions about the handbook that require compliance expertise. I'm not the person to write those. I understand we may have a few volunteers who are. Also, I think we should state prominently, even though it's not been asked, that we believe that no changes should be made to the handbook without plugging loopholes in consumer duty and attaching a private right of action to the consumer duty. I think we should approach other consumer bodies to take a similar approach, and of course notify politicians and the media. Now, what about politicians and the media? I think anything you can do to shame the FCA and the Treasury and the City into a volte-face would be much appreciated. Why does it want to be 2 steps below the American equivalent, Wall Street, and the IFAs and equivalents all around the country, when it could be only 1 step below? Actually, 1 step below is actually itself quite bad. But to refuse the opportunity to be 1 step below when you're currently 2, I think is appalling. Raise the issue in Treasury questions, backbench business debates, etc. Dovetail with discussion with the APPG on investment fraud and fairer financial services about its call for evidence about the FCA. So this is an exercise that the APPG commissioned and asked us at Transparency Task Force to carry out, where we asked people who'd interacted with the FCA, other than through being authorised firms and individuals, what they thought about their experience of interacting with that organisation. And it will publish a report probably later in this year. And it is in many respects quite damning, but it's also constructive because there was a panel called the Recommendations Panel, and as the name suggests, its job was to come up with recommendations. And it did come up with some very constructive and I think quite reasonable and easily implemented proposals for improving the situation. Finally, supportive media coverage would help to encourage parliamentarians to act. I also think it's worth talking about how to pitch it. So when we as campaigners or when politicians are thinking about what to do about this kind of audacious kind of land grab of rights, I think this is the approach I would recommend. Don't campaign against the consumer duty. Pointless. It's not going away. This is realpolitik here. A lot of firms have invested a lot of money in making themselves compliant with it, changing documentation, doing market research, heaven knows what else, training staff. A lot of that cost has happened. They are not about to bin it. So accept that it's going to exist. There are also a lot of reputations at stake. Imagine what would happen to senior leadership of the FCA if the consumer duty and its abolition was forced upon them. Much better, I think, to say it exists and we'd like to find ways of making it better. And that really forms 2 main parts. The first is to close the loopholes and get rid of exclusions. The unauthorised firms in the supply and distribution chain is a big one. Another one is what's called the enduring rights of firms under historical unfair products. So if I'm running an authorised firm and I've got a product that treats consumers very unfairly, but I've already got 100,000 consumers signed up to that product, my rights under that product cannot be changed by the consumer duty. So I can continue to treat them unfairly, which seems somewhat perverse if we're trying to improve the standards in the industry. But that is what it says at the moment. And you might think that is intangible, but it's used, for example, to justify why mortgage prisoners cannot be offered the same mortgage rates by the existing lenders as they would in the wider market. We should definitely argue for a private right of action to be attached to the consumer duty for breaches and for the FCA to have full powers under Section 404 and 382-4 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, known as FSMA. If the industry intends to comply with this consumer duty, then why wouldn't it want that to happen? What would it have to fear from consumers having that right? If the industry is against this right, that tells you something very significant. which is it fears that there's a liability there. And finally, I think it's important that the consumer duty should be subject to ongoing review, maybe over 2 or 3 years, because things change in the world. You know, things that work today may not work tomorrow. So that's it, really. That's my pitch. I believe that the consumer duty was and is an audacious bait and switch, and that we should try wherever we can to fix the situation by lobbying on the basis of evidence and of being reasonable.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Folks, before we do anything else, I think it's appropriate that we show our appreciation to Mark for preparing and delivering that presentation. Not only is it taking time to do that, but believe me, there's been a lot of thinking behind trying to see what's really been going on there. Mark, we're all very grateful to you for doing that, delivering it in the way that you have.
Thanks, Andy.
In a very non-technical way, I'm going to try to effectively summarise what Mark has said in my non-technical way. I think I'm right in saying that on 14 separate occasions, please don't quote me on that number, I think it's right, but I'm not certain, on 14 separate occasions over about the last 15 years, parliamentarians in both houses have discussed the idea of a duty of care being introduced into the UK financial services sector. And they've discussed the idea of a duty of care being introduced into the UK's financial services sector because there's been one scandal after another, after another, after another. Endowment and selling, Barlow Clowes, Equitable Life, Woodford, Blackmore Bond, Connaught, Premier Effects. Believe me, there's a very, very long list. And every time something happens that causes consumer harm, there hasn't been an efficient, effective mechanism for people to get redress and justice. They've had to, when it's been available, and indefinitely will speak to that particular point, go to the Financial Ombudsman Service, which may or may not apply in their favour. If there was a duty of care, it would basically mean that consumers would have the right to use the judicial processes, the courts, to say to a company, you sold me something that was wrong for me, you've caused me harm, I can prove it, please put me back in the position I was in before it all happened. 14 times-ish, Parliament has discussed it and said, we like the idea of that. And then, as Mark said, in the Financial Services and Markets Act 2021, not only did they discuss it, they actually legislated for the FCA to consult on introducing a duty of care. We were truly, truly astonished when we started to gradually see that this wonderful development that we had been quite excited about, this possibility of the introduction of the duty of care, was vanishing away. And the FCA were arguing that no, we don't need one of those. A consumer duty is the same thing, really. And then the Bar Council, the trade body of the barristers in the UK, basically responded to the consultation exactly as Mark said and says, hold on a minute, this actually is a duty of care. You're trying to describe this as a duty of care. Everybody in the legal profession knows that a duty of care has inherent rights within it. It's a powerful legal instrument. And a consumer duty is essentially, platitudes. It's an extension of the whole treating customers fairly bit. It puts all the power in the regulator's hands for them to apply on what is right and wrong and what they can and can't do. Those of you who are here tonight who are victims of the Building Society scandal, amongst many others, will know that the FCA's perception of right and wrong isn't always our perception of right and wrong. So putting them in charge of that decision is rather tricky. And then we push back and we respond to the consultation, and we got a letter back from the Treasury that effectively acknowledged that yes, the consumer duty is not a duty of care. Now, I'm going to share my screen with you folks before we go to Q&A. This is a remarkably interesting conversation happening, and I'm so pleased that Mark's kicked things off. I'm going to take you back in time I'm going to take you back in time to 2015, October 2015. The Investment Association is the trade body of the asset management industry. And it had, for a period of time, a very progressive individual leading it, Daniel Godfrey. Daniel Godfrey, we got to know quite well. He was very into transparency. In fact, he was doing some terrific work at the Investment Association, looking to introduce the idea of best interests. He basically wanted the asset managers in the UK to sign up to a code that basically said, we pledge to always look after our clients and put their interests first. He, no doubt, thought it was a pretty cool, progressive thing to do. And there were definitely lots of people in the Investment Association itself who also thought that was a pretty good, progressive thing to do. It would obviously improve client care, it would improve client outcomes, it would improve the reputation of the industry. But what actually happened, this is absolute gospel, the evidence is all there. What actually happened was that some of the big investment managers, I'm not going to name them, but I think they're mentioned in this article, actually said, if you carry on going down this road, Mr. Godfrey, we're going to stop being members of the Investment Association. And over a period of literally a few days, I think, if I'm right, Daniel Godfrey ended up getting sacked by the Investment Association for basically trying to do something to make the industry he was helping to govern put client interests first. Now, you might be asking yourself, yeah, but what's that got to do with what Mark's been talking about? You see, it's got a lot to do with what Mark's been just talking about. It's a literal example of the ability of the industry to put its own commercial interests ahead of the consumer interest. Full stop. There is no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, that given that the UK's financial services sector has approximately 8% of GDP, it is phenomenally influential. I would love to have been a fly on the wall when, no doubt, conversations took place between the industry and the FCA after Parliament said we want a duty of care. One wonders if there were conversations around the industry saying, FCA, we don't want that duty of care. That's going to give us all sorts of risks and liabilities. We don't want that kind of accountability. And maybe that's why, despite Parliament enacting the introduction of the duty of care, that's why it didn't actually happen. Surely one day somebody's going to write a book or make a film or whatever about this, and all the truth will come out. But we are where we are. We don't have rights in the public that the consumer wanted. Before we go to Ian Duffield, I'd love to hear comments or questions from what Mark has said. No doubt there'll be those amongst you who quite understandably will be saying to yourself, this can't possibly be true. I don't believe it. There may be others of you thinking, you know what, this actually all stacks up and is in keeping with your own views about what the FCA tends to do these days. Would anybody like to come in with a comment or a question before we go to Mr. Ian Duffield? Thank you. Brian Hall, thank you.
Yeah, just picking up on what Mark was saying, I sort of agree with everything that he's saying. But I think there's an even larger picture that's important to consider. I take the view that virtually all the scams and scandals we've had in recent decades were breaches of the regulatory framework. Okay, the problem was that bad actors didn't do what they were supposed to do. So we look at all the large ones like Mark outlined, and PPI mis-selling and all of these other sorts of huge scams and scandals, cost tens of billions of pounds, were breaches of the regulatory framework. And so I would be very cautious about diluting that regulatory framework, which I think is what the FCA are planning to do. They're looking at overlaps and looking to eliminate overlaps. And I understand that. But the regulatory work actually is quite complicated. It's not just what's under the control of the FCA. There's other issues around common law and statutes and so on that all overlap, create a tapestry, and that provides a means by which consumers can actually take action. Many of the most potent things that consumers could use, for example, the principles of business, are not actionable by consumers, and that's a problem. And there seems to be, over time, a dilution, a reduction in the sort of various different parts of that regulatory framework that consumers can use. So, for example, if we go back just a few years, the Council of Mortgage Lenders, which regulated, the non-statutory regulator for the Industry Association for the mortgage industry, had a mortgage code. The British Bankers Association had a banking code. The Finance and Leasing Association had a lending code. And under the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading regulations, those were mandatory standards of professional diligence, as far as I can see. So if an organization, a bank, was a member of the British Bankers Association, which had a code, and that bank took actions that breached that code, then there was some sort of potential redress. Now, what I've noticed is not only is the FCA looking to dilute what they're responsible for, what they have control over, but also the industry is eliminating a number of these codes. So the Council of Mortgage Lenders and the British Bankers Association and the credit cards people got together to create UK Finance, and there is no code now for those particular sectors, for the mortgage industry, for example. Now, they may have something internally that they publish to their members, but it's not available to consumers. So there's no code that you can shake a stick at if these organizations do something they shouldn't be doing. So my concern is not just that the FCA are potentially diluting something under their control, but also they're letting the industries get away with eliminating these codes. I take the view that the regulator has this principles-based regulation, which I quite like. So the regulator defines certain principles that the regulator's firm should follow. And the logical thing then is for the industry to say, okay, well, the regulator's saying we have to follow these principles. What does that mean for us? What are the specific rules or codes that we should implement to ensure that our members don't breach those principles of business? And I think what's actually happening is the reverse is happening. Those codes are being eliminated, and that's having a negative effect on consumers. So that's my view, having looked at the regulatory framework as it's so reduced over the last 15 years. So that's my tuppence halfpenny worth.
Brian Hall, thank you very much. For those of you that don't know, Brian's doing a tremendous amount of work, along with folks like Nigel Pence and surprise, Mark Bishop, in helping to complete the report on the FCA that the all-party parliamentary group is working on. Please do forgive the background noise, folks, here. We're going to go straight from Brian to Martin White and to Lisa. Martin, please be as succinct as you possibly can for me. Same with Lisa. We just don't have time for some short comments because I want to go back to Mark before we then pass over to Ian Duffield. Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Over to you, Martin, as quick as you can. Thank you.
Yeah, don't worry. I can always be concise. Into the chat, I put links to a paper that I wrote that won first prize in a public interest essay competition at the Institute of Actuaries. The chief judge was John Kay, and I put some quotes from that into the chat because they were relevant. There was a quote where I mentioned, to see what's going on, just try Googling St James's Place sales culture, and I also have put my little section on the story that we just heard about Daniel Godfrey. It's my very strong view that the power is in the Treasury, and I don't believe Parliament, I don't believe the MPs in Parliament actually realise the extent to which the dice are loaded against the public. I think if MPs really, really understood it, they wouldn't stand for it. So that's my plea to MPs. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Martin. And of course, when we're talking about, the Treasury or the FCA, inevitably a very, very, very high proportion of people working in these organisations are only interested in doing one thing, which is a really, really good job. But there are sometimes conflicts of interest. You know, the classic conflict of interest in the regulatory framework is prudential regulation versus conduct regulation. For example, let's imagine a bank did something really, really bad, really bad, and you want to fine them and tell them off and sack the people responsible, etc., etc. Well, that seems like a sensible thing to do. But what if you're also somehow responsible for the ongoing commercial viability of that bank and its prudential status, in other words, its ability to carry on operating? Can you see how sometimes there are tensions there that cause things to end up being pulled in the wrong direction? And I personally think this whole fiasco around duty of care and consumer duty is a superb example of what can happen if you get a regulator being pulled in two different directions. I'm oversimplifying to the nth degree, but it comes down to citizen being pulling it in one direction and the city pulling it in another. Now, what progressives like myself and Mark want is actually the best of all worlds. What we want is a really successful, flourishing City of London, but based on good products, good service, complete transparency, tender loving care of your clients. All that's perfectly possible. There does not have to be a trade-off between the profit margin in the industry, I would argue, Martin, and the well-being of the client. Lisa King, as quickly as you can before we go back to Mark. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you.
Hi, Andy. Hi, everyone. It's just a quick thing I just wanted to say. 2 weeks ago, Paul Kiley did an excellent presentation on the car finance scandal that's going around at the moment. And we know the FCA are doing their best to stall this. Well, I made a complaint to the FCA about Black Horse back in 2019. And the response from the FCA was quite staggering. They say that, and this is, I will quote what they say. They say that, just bear with me, lost my train of thought there, that the agreement that we had with Black Horse was in 2011. And they say, this is the FCA who knew about this finance scam. They say, it is important to note, however, that as the agreement your complaint relates to was taken out in March 2011, our rules would unlikely be applicable in your case because the FCA did not take over regulation of consumer credit products until the 1st of April 2014, and our rules aren't retrospective. So that was a lie. And yet again, they're covering themselves because the actual investigation, and I'll say that in a very loose term, is from 2007 to 2021. And I just get the impression with all my dealings with the FCA that they do their utmost to do nothing, to take no responsibility. And when they are pushed, they'll find some rule in their handbook that says, oh no, it's nothing to do with us because it's something that we don't cover, it's nothing to do with us. And I just find it absolutely astonishing that the United Kingdom has a regulator who cannot regulate, and it's just appalling to have to sit here and you know, listen to what Mark Bishop says, which is all true and all accurate and shines a light on how poor we are at regulating our financial institutions.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you very, very much. You put that so sharply and so succinctly, and I'm very grateful to you for it. There's obviously a theme coming across tonight, isn't there? And please understand, folks, this is not something coming from anywhere other than a huge frustration about the way things are, because we know how they could be. We really do know how they could be. If the FCA wasn't immune from civil liability, if it did have a heavy-duty oversight body in charge, it might be latest in Australia now. If it was being properly held to account, it would be transformed, surely. Last words from Mark Bishop, then we'll go to Ian Duffield. Thank you very much. Again, please excuse the background noise here. I can't do much about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll deal first with Lisa's comment and then Brian Hall's. So Lisa King said she had a problem, a dispute with the bank. She and her husband, I think from 2011, regarding consumer credit. Consumer Credit Act came into effect in 2007, so it was definitely under that act. However, the FCA gained responsibility for regulating consumer credit only in 2014, and therefore it's saying it can't do anything. Unfortunately, and I don't often defend the FCA. Unfortunately, it's right, because there is a problem here, which is that there was therefore this 7-year gap when the Consumer Credit Act existed, but the FCA didn't exist, during which time the party responsible for regulating consumer credit was the OFT, the Office of Fair Trading. Now that was abolished. That's one of the acts of the Cameron government, was to get rid of it, and therefore this consumer credit regulation came to the FCA. At the time, the government either made an error or decided to go easy on the lenders, depending on your view, by not grandfathering the responsibilities of the OFT in respect of consumer credit to the FCA. Basically, what it should have done, in my view, is to say to the FCA, from now on, you're responsible. And by the way, anything that happened after 2007, you are responsible for that as well, because you are assuming the rights and responsibilities that previously were enjoyed by the OFT, which is now being abolished. So that would have saved a lot of pain, because what's happened in the absence of that is a regulatory lacuna of 7 years worth of transactions where there is no regulator. Nobody can retrospectively sort them out. I'll now deal with what Brian has raised. And Brian actually, I think, has raised probably the single biggest debate in financial services regulation since the Financial Services Act 2000 FSMA came into being. And that is, what is the best method for regulation? Is it principle-based or is it outcome-based? FSMA introduced a principle-based form of regulation. The FCA had a series of principles for business. I think there were originally 10, then that was extended to 11, and the consumer duty is the 12th. So there are now 12 principles for business. These are principles, ways of conducting oneself that all authorized persons are required to honor. Of course, the good parties in the industry do their very best to be entirely consistent with the principles for business. The bad ones might not. The question is, what happens if you breach one of the principles for business? Well, the FCA has the right to enforce against you. It can fine you, it can ban you from the industry, can remove permissions, restricting what you can do. It can also impose on you the obligation to pay restitution to a small group of people or redress to a whole class of people. But consumers cannot sue. They can only sue for the breaches of the consumer duty, the breaches of the rules in the handbook. And because the consumer duty is one of the principles for business, you can't sue for that. So this is the problem that we have. Now, the people who saw originally FSMA coming out with this principle-based regulation said, yeah, well, that is light touch regulation, because these principles are merely platitudes. Firms don't have to obey them, and there's no guarantee that the regulator will go down the route of enforcement, restitution, and redress. So people will get away with a lot. And of course, they had a point. And therefore, the solution introduced was consumer duty. Consumer duty claims to be an outcome-based form of rules, well, they're not really rules, but a set of principles. And outcomes matter, but they are not the only solution. One of the reasons is that the gap between the transaction occurring and the outcome being known can be very large in financial services. If it's food, if you go into a supermarket and you buy some contaminated food, you're going to have food poisoning within 24 hours. We're going to know about it quite quickly. So outcome-based regulation is good in some sectors, but in a sector like financial services, you take out a life insurance policy today, you die in 30 years' time, and they don't pay out. By the time we know that that firm is trying to avoid its obligations, actually, it will have written so many of these policies that the cost of putting it right via the Financial Services Compensation Scheme would be onerous. So you also have to have principle-based regulation, but they have to be on the same level as each other. Whether there is a breach of the principles or there is a bad outcome, there have to be forms of redress that are not solely dependent on the whim and the gift of the regulator.
And You're now going to hear from Ian Duffield. Ian is going to be talking about his own situation, him and his wife. Again, folks, I invite you to suspend disbelief because Ian's going to be talking about things and explaining things that your mind is going to resist wanting to believe because it sounds too ridiculous. But it's not. It's actually true. I was there in court when the battle that Ian's about to describe took place, and I witnessed it firsthand along with Mark. Mr. Ian Duffield, over to you. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Andy, and thank you everybody for your time here and in listening to what I'm about to tell you. This is a shameful story, and the background of it, very, very briefly, is that the government introduced in FSMA 2000 the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, or it led to the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, and that's the scheme where you can recover up to £82,000 if you are a consumer, if you have been wronged or defrauded or something similar. And this story is about how the FCA not only did not protect myself and my wife, but actually betrayed us in as much as it removed our rights to access the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which applied to Woodford Equity Income Fund and even advertised in the Woodford Equity Income Fund prospectus and much lauded about on the FCA's website. So Neil Woodford, CBE, left Invesco Perpetual in 2014. Invesco was fined £18 million, that was reduced from 26 million for early settlement, by the FCA for ignoring rules designed to limit risks to investors' risk. Invesco revealed that 2 of the 3 funds responsible for that breach and the subsequent fine were managed by Neil Woodford. Woodford went his own way with a partner, Craig Newman. His flagship fund was Woodford Equity Income Fund. Bizarrely, the FCA told him that he had to use Capita as his authorised corporate director, and Capita another known rule breaker. The ACD's job, the authorised corporate director, which was Capita, their job is to oversee the proper management of a fund. Capita had previously been involved in 2 large scandals, Archcrew and Connaught, and were penalised heavily by the FCA. Subsequently, they were sold to an Australian company and rebranded as Link Fund Solutions and continued as the ACD for WAIF, Woodford Equity Income Fund. Now, my wife Linda and I are both retired. We'd worked hard, saved hard. We had savings in ISAs. I had 2 SIPs. So putting the money under the mattress at home did not really seem like a good solution. And so being new to investments and not knowing of Woodford's or Capita's history, we invested over £200,000 in WEEF over the following couple of years. The main reason for that was to gain the protection of the Financial Services Compensation Scheme as advertised in the WEEF prospectus and by the FCA. And Woodford was lauded throughout the financial press as probably the best fund manager in the country, even an article in the Times saying the man who cannot stop making money. Now, we've peaked at over £10 billion in 2017. However, Woodford had gone back to his old ways of exposing his investors to risk and had been investing heavily in small liquid companies and risky startups. Woodford committed a whole raft of questionable and risky finance and regulatory breaches. Neither Link nor the FCA stopped him. And WEEF was suspended in June 2019 when it could not meet a large redemption of investors' money was then locked in, and it stood at just 3.2 billion. So from 10 billion in 2017, it had collapsed down to 3.2 billion within the space of a couple of years. The fund closed in October 2019. Woodford's company, Woodford Investment Management, took £8 million in fees out of investors' money during the 4-month suspension. During the 5 years of operation, Woodford and Newman had taken £100 million jointly in dividends. Some people believe more. Several group litigations were commenced, of which Linda, my wife, and I were involved with one of them. The FCA, after another 4 years, decided Link were liable for just 298 million of losses due to what they called illiquidity issues. Now, at that point, 400,000 investors in WEEF, their capital losses actually stood at over £1 billion, 1.1 billion to be precise. Plus, there were additional losses of nearly 5 years of returns while their money had been held hostage. Their money, mine and my wife's money. The FCA negotiated a scheme of arrangement with Link, previously Capita, to pay just £230 million, with £45 million of that being deferred as a reserve to cover costs. So we go from 1.1 billion loss of investors' money down to just short of 300 million that the FCA said Link Fund Solutions were liable for, to now a scheme of arrangement of just 230 million, and 45 million of that in costs actually being paid by the investors. If we ever see any more of that 45 million referral, I'll probably drop down unconscious. The FCA loudly trumpeted that investors would get back, and I quote, 77p in the pound. This was repeated untruthfully by Bim Afalami of the Treasury in the House of Commons in response to an MP's question. Now, my wife Linda and I, after the various distributions made by Link as the fund was being wound down, still had £107,000 loss of capital. Right? This is after the money that was still available in the fund was sorted out and repaid in small amounts over a 2 to 3 year period. So of £107,000 loss of capital, that's plus there was an additional estimated £27,000 in loss of returns, but we'll put that to one side for the moment. Over the nearly 5 years of WEEF's suspension, and under the scheme of arrangement, we received just £7,600 jointly of 107,000. So that's not 77p in the pound. In fact, it's 7p in the pound. So our net loss of capital, we got 7,000 back under the scheme of arrangement of £100,000. That was 47% of our investment. And as I say, all we got back was 7p in the pound. 1/10 of what the FCA had announced. The 77p in the pound was misinformation, deliberately designed, in my opinion, by the FCA to mislead investors, particularly consumers, into voting for the scheme of arrangement, because a scheme of arrangement requires 75% or greater of the people to vote. And we're talking consumers here. Most consumers, retail investors as consumers, tend to be in somewhat more advanced years on pensions, life savings, and don't fully understand or are able to unpick the immense complicated legislation and contractual things that go around this. And therefore, that is why there is such a thing as known as consumer protection, that in the retail world, you go and buy something in a store, you're covered. You don't have to worry about unpicking a finely worded contract because you're granted statutory rights. And we believe those statutory rights were granted to us by the FCS under FSMA, the compensation scheme. Now, what's absolutely appalling is that the scheme of arrangement meant that the group litigations had to be abandoned, could no longer continue. Link has now been sold on to Mitsubishi, and Woodford has walked away untouched, very rich man. Even worse, the FCA prohibited retail investors, who are consumers, from any right of access to the financial services compensation scheme under the scheme of arrangement, and deliberately misled them. Okay, did not tell them that up front, did not tell them that it's not 77p in the pound, it's only going to be 7p. And oh, by the way, you can't go to the financial services compensation scheme if this scheme of arrangement goes through, which it did. Now, given that the compensation scheme was introduced by Parliament as a result of Parliament passing into law the Financial Services Markets Act 2000, what right does the FCA have to subvert the will of Parliament? We are a democracy, and retrospectively remove what consumers have believed, my wife and I believed, to be a statutory consumer right. I'm sure most of you still believe that if you put money in a bank and it goes under, you'll get protected up to the sum of £22,000. But the FCA has just demonstrated they can remove that if they so choose, which is what they did to Linda and I. In April 2024, the FCA issued a warning notice to Woodford and his company, criticising his behaviour and saying they may investigate him. In closing, I would like to cite Charles Randall, chair of the FCA, who, as a result of the Connaught Scandal Independent Review, stated in 2020, and I quote, "There are a number of things we could have done better in our supervision of these two firms," meaning Connaught, and both reports highlight the need for the FCA to continue to change to better protect consumers from harm. We accept all the recommendations that have been made to the FCA, and we are profoundly sorry for the mistakes we have made. Consumers must have trust in the FCA to do its job properly. Now, to me, Randall's words are hollow and meaningless. Linda and I would have been better off if we had put our money under the mattress. Thank you.
Mr. Ian Duffield, thank you. Can we please show our appreciation to it? It's not easy talking about such a devastating thing that's happened. And Ian is a very determined man, but he's got a very strong sense of right and wrong, and he's been a wonderful campaigner within the Woodford campaign group at TTF. Folks, we're going to go straight from here to Richard Emery. Richard's going to cover his ground as succinctly as he can, and then we're going to invite Sam Rushworth, the MP, who is I'm so pleased to say, is co-chairing the APPG. TTF provides the Secretariat for. So far, folks, I hope you agree with me. It's been wonderful stuff from Mark Bishop, wonderful stuff from Ian Duffield. Over to you now, Richard Emery. Thank you.
Hi there. Let me see if I can manage to share my screen. First of all, Mark, thank you hugely for the incredibly good overview of where all this has happened and how all this has gone on. What I wanted to do was just ask Andy if I could just have a few minutes to be very narrowly focused on an issue which has been of a concern to me ever since I read what it said in the Consumer Duty. Because I read something in the Consumer Duty and I thought, this looks really good, this looks really helpful. Unfortunately, the reality has been somewhat different. And it is this. Paragraph 2.8 of the Consumer Duty has the cross-cutting rules. These are rules that apply across all areas of conduct, and they require firms to do three things. And it's the middle one, which Mark has already mentioned about this, which is that it would be very, very clear in a duty of care. It is included in the Consumer Duty, avoid causing foreseeable harm to retail customers. So the FCA put that in there. And what I want to do is look at three examples of where the FCA has not actually acted to make sure that this really happens. So what I'm saying is this, that avoid causing foreseeable harm means that the banks, so payment service providers, banks, firms, must develop and implement fraud prevention systems and processes to address known frauds, because failing to do so causes foreseeable harm. So a lot of the work I'm doing in terms of APP fraud is the question of, did the bank do enough to prevent the fraud? Have they got the right systems and processes in place? And to what extent is the FCA and the payment systems regulator actually making them put these systems and processes into place? So I have three examples. There are three issues to me: payment delays, confirmation of payee, spoofing phone numbers. Okay, now payment delays, let me see if I can manage to get the whole of this. Oh, no, it's all right. Now I think you've got all the words anyway. Now, about 6 years ago, I became very concerned at the speed with which fraudsters extracted money from people's bank accounts. So they contact the individual, they pretend that they're coming from the bank, and the result is that the victim of the fraud creates a new payee and paid huge amounts of money to that new payee instantly. I mean, that's the whole point about the faster payment system. It is instant payment, including instant payment to new payees. So I submitted papers to the financial services, to the banks, to UK Finance, and said, hang on, folks, let's have a mandatory delay of 24 hours between the creation of a new payee and a high value payment to go into that payee. And I got back a response that said, first of all, it was inconvenient. And secondly, it was not allowed under PSR 2017. Okay, so inconvenient. Here's my question to the whole audience. When was the last time you made a payment of more than £500 to somebody that you had never paid before and didn't have their payment details at least 24 hours before they needed the money? And the answer I've got in the last 6 years has cited only one example of when it would be mildly inconvenient. People say, well, hang on, when my solicitor tells me I need to pay over the £100,000 deposit on the house, they need me to pay today. Yes, but you've already made payments to them and they gave you their bank details 2 months ago when you started the transaction. So it's not a new payee. It would be okay. The issue is always about high value payments to new payees. So I argue it's not at all inconvenient. But they then said, and this was an issue I actually had with UK Finance, but at the end of the day, it also goes back to the regulator, the FCA. They said it's not allowed under PSR 2017. And that what they quoted was that the money from a faster payment has to be in the payee's bank within 2 hours. Yes, that is true, but it is also an absolute lie, because that 2 hour rule applies from when the beneficiary bank gets the money and puts the money in the beneficiary's account. That doesn't take into account when my bank sends it to the beneficiary. My bank can delay it by 24 hours. So we have this situation where the regulations very clearly say by the end of the business day following the time of receipt of the payment order. So that's perfectly clear. It was allowed. But actually we now have the FCA under the Guidance Consultation 24/5, which has just come out, that they are now proposing to allow the sending bank up to 4 business days to release the payment to the beneficiary. So you can be trying to pay £100,000 to your solicitor as a deposit on your new house, and your bank can go, we think this is fraud. We are going to hold that payment for up to 4 business days. And the only right of recourse you have is the loss of interest on that money. Now, this is something which, as far as I'm concerned, the FCA is sneaking in, and they're doing it as part of the whole development of benefiting the financial services industry. And they're doing it as part of some other changes that are coming along. Now, my observation about this is I don't disagree with the concept of having a longer delay, but actually the delay is in the wrong place. Because in reality, if you put the delay in the hands of the receiving bank, the one thing the receiving bank can't see is the beneficiary bank details. What they're trying to do is they're being concerned about the prudential status of smaller banks that may receive fraudulent payments and then be required to reimburse 50% of those payments under the new mandatory reimbursement process. So they're trying to put in a level of protection. But my view is, if you actually put that up to 4-day delay in the hands of the beneficiary bank, so my bank sends the money to the beneficiary's bank within the business day, but with a tag on it that says, we think this might be fraud, you might like to look at this, they can then contact their customer and say, why are you receiving this £100,000? Answer, we're a firm of solicitors. Oh, okay, we can release the payment straight away. So I think they've got it wrong, and we need to challenge this consultation called GC 24/5. So it's an example of where the FCA is acting in a way that I believe is very, very unhelpful. Okay,
Richard, I know that you're going to be sharing your slides, which is fantastic. I'm keen that we give Rushford the chance to introduce himself and share any thoughts he has. Would you like to finish off your key points, and then we'll bring your piece to the
right. So let me just say this, right? The next thing I have is confirmation of payee. This is a succession of failures by the FCA. It should have been introduced in 2013 or 2014. It was eventually introduced 7 years too late. And we should have taken the example of SurePay in Holland, which is a far better system. So the FCA introduced the wrong system and didn't introduce it properly. And then this other one, just to end up with, it's a fairly small point, but actually it's very important in a number of the fraud cases I've dealt with. You get a phone call and the person says, you know, I'm calling from your bank because you can check my phone number against your bank card. Now, I'm going to ask the question, how many of you know what a DNO number is? And I only discovered it relatively recently. A DNO number is one that does not originate. So your bank can say, we never make outgoing calls from the number on your back of your bank card. Therefore, therefore that number can't be spoofed because it's a number that we never actually use for outgoing calls. And that is something which is a cooperation between the telephone industry and the banks. And I want to say all payment service providers should register under the DNO system. Thank you, folks.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Folks, just before we go to Sam Rushworth, can I please invite everybody to once again show our appreciation to our speakers, Richard and Mark. It's been really, really, really good stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Sam Rushworth, it would be wonderful if you don't mind just telling everybody a little bit about yourself, what led you to become an MP and any reflections you may want to think about in relation to tonight's event. Thank you very much, Sam. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it brief. I'm conscious that the people have probably got tea to get to and things, but yeah, this has been a really helpful meeting, and there's a huge amount of knowledge amongst the people on this call. I was struck as Ian was talking about the fact that there are so many people who worked really hard, put away for retirement, and are now spending their retirement fighting battles rather than being able to rest and enjoy life. And I think that that's a horrible position to see so many people in. So my background's actually in international development, and so I'm very new to learning about the financial services sector. But I don't mind saying my original interest was sparked by the fact that a few years ago, my wife and I sold our house, and we weren't going to be buying a new one for a while. So we decided to store our money somewhere. And like a lot of people, we were deceived by one of these unscrupulous companies. We only lost £6,000, and it's nothing to cry about. But through that, I got connected to a community of people, and who have lost the lump sums of their pensions and very large sums of money. I'm fortunate that being only 40 and from a working class background, I didn't have a lot of capital to lose in the first place. But it was quite alarming, and this is the thing that sort of rankles me the most about the FCA and this whole process really is, I think ordinary lay people have a reasonable assumption that the law should protect them, and that there should be protection against people who are dishonest and who take their money and they discover that the law doesn't protect them. And in my situation and all the people who invested in this, I'm online searching for a high interest savings account. I'm looking for a regular high street bank. I just want to save some money. I put my phone number and email address in, and I get a phone call from a company that sounds very legit, and they give a lot of assurances. And the other thing is, it's clear that in some of these cases there is actually fraud going on. But so I think it's not just about a lack of regulation, it's about a lack of justice, and it's about the fact that ordinary people really struggle to actually fight their own battles and get the authorities to take seriously their victim status. And it seems to me wrong as well that people can engage in these bad practices, fold a company and set a new one up the next day, having run off with people's money, because at the end of the day, this money hasn't disappeared. It's sitting with people who have got rich out of other people's misery. I was very interested to understand that from the presentation at the beginning about this point around duty of care. I can well understand how MPs could be completely hoodwinked by this, because it's really rather complicated. And as I've said to Andy before, I have a first in economics, so I'm not an idiot. But I've had a guy who worked all his life as a binman in tears on the phone to me, telling me how stupid he feels that he was conned in this way. And I hope it gave him some reassurance to say, mate, I've got a PhD. Like I work in, you know, in economic development, but I didn't know about the world of finance. And so I really hope that we can work together on some of these things. Just a final thing really is just the FCA, in my experience, and another thing that's not been touched on tonight, is that sometimes they can actually create the misery by so in our situation, the thing that finally undermined confidence in the business is that after allowing basically unsophisticated investors to be cold called and put their money into something with a lot of promises that weren't true, finally the FCA cottoned onto this and put out a warning that this company wasn't to be touched, and that's what eventually put that company into administration. So it was actually the FCA's very belated protection of consumers by issuing a warning that ended up being a lot of people's downfall as well. So, but for me, I'm in a space of learning. I've got a huge passion and commitment to fight for people. And this, you know, you asked, Andy, why did I come into politics? Because I'm sick of the world being too unfair, and I'm sick of ordinary people not being treated right, and whether that's children, youth, adults, pensioners, and this is one of those issues where you see that the playing field is not level, and where the odds are stacked against people. And I've got a huge amount of learning to do in order to be able to help fight this battle. And I'm just really grateful to you and others who you've put me in contact with, that I now know that I've got people who've got the expertise that I lack to keep me informed and to keep giving me things to read, because I think we do have a battle on our hands, but I think that it's a battle that's worth fighting in this Parliament, because both to change things for the future, but also to see what can be done about helping people who have been wronged to access the justice that they're currently not able to access. And I'll leave it there.
Sam, there's a wonderful Mark Twain quote that you just reminded me of, because what you just said in that one sentence, I'm sick of the world being too unfair. In that one sentence, you encapsulate a lifetime of wisdom. In all honesty, the Mark Twain quote that I frequently think about is, the two most important days in a man's life are, number one, the day he's born, and number two, the day he learns why. And that sense of why, that sense of purposefulness, whatever it was that brought you into politics, whatever it was that led you to become a co-chair of the APPG, please understand that from the point of view of these folk here on this Zoom meeting tonight, and the thousands of others in the TTF community, hearing somebody like you in your position say what you've said tonight is so unbelievably important. People are losing hope, Sam. They are really losing hope. They're losing trust and confidence in the system, because the system's not working the way it's meant to. And it's becoming increasingly obvious. We will do all we can, sir, to work with you and to help you put things right, because we're on exactly the same wavelength. Can I please invite everyone to show their appreciation to Sam for speaking so straightforwardly with us tonight? This is exactly what we need. This is exactly what we need. I'm not going to get party political. TTF is not party political at all. But the fact is, we've got a new government that's got a fresh opportunity to look at some old stuff, maybe with new eyes, and come up with different views. We're going to bring this session to a close very, very quickly. I'm just going to invite anybody that is itching to say anything that hasn't previously spoken to do so. Please raise your hand if you'd like to make a point. Otherwise, I'm going to very briefly bring tonight's conversation to a close. Brian, you spoke before. I just want to give anybody else a chance who hasn't yet spoken a chance to do that.
Something.
Lata,
I just want to say I'm inspired by what Sam said. So thank you very much.
I think you're not the only one, Brian. Thank you. Lata, please be very, very quick for me. Thank you. I'll say yes to you because what you spoke about before was a housekeeping item, not sharing a particular point. So please, but be quick for me, Lata. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for this intriguing what's it called? Anyway, Zoom discussion.
Good.
And I welcome Sam Rushworth, the MP.
And I welcome Sam Rushworth, the MP.
Wonderful that he's experienced firsthand. I'm not saying, but he can learn how vulnerable we all are when we haven't got that understanding of the rules and the laws and the legalities and the con men. We're really up against a lot of scamming. And no matter how educated and well learned we are, can you imagine the ones who don't understand language, who don't understand the system? And it's like he said, it's not a level playing field. It's all stacked up against us. Now, what are we going to do about finding the solutions? We've got to make the laws ourselves, because laws are set up not to protect us at the moment, and we need to have the capability to have the laws that we want to see in place to protect us and to safeguard.
Martin, thank you so much. I think you make a really, really important point. In our experience, in all honesty, folks, we think that most of the laws that are needed, if not in fact all of them, are actually already there. The issue is how they're being applied and whether the FCA is being sufficiently enthusiastic with its consumer protection agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. It's always great to share these ideas. It really is always great to share these ideas. Can I once again invite everybody to show our appreciation to Mark Bishop, Ian Duffield, also Richard Emery, and last, Sam Rushworth. Thank you all very, very much indeed. Cheers, Sam. Great to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Good night to all. Have a good rest of your evening. We'll circulate the recording in due course. Cheers, Mark. Well done. Thank you very much. Good night all. Good night. Good night. Enjoy your tea. Enjoy your tea. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.